Good evening from the Cambridge Center for Palestine Studies in Cambridge, England, UK. We are delighted to see that all panelists are with us, I believe. We have got a most distinguished lineup tonight, and we are definitely delighted to have you all, and in particular to celebrate the release of the book, A Life of Edward Said, by Professor Timothy Brennan. We are delighted to be holding this special session to celebrate and mark the release of the most comprehensive and first biography for the late Edward Said, the Palestinian American intellectual and academic. We are truly pleased that Professor Timothy Brennan has dedicated this slot to share with us his experience in embarking on this tremendous project. We are talking about a book which is in fact a volume, nearly 500 pages, a remarkable work, practically a pioneering work. And we will be, in fact, starting with an opening address, and then we will be moving on to hear from Professor Brennan himself, and later on we will be taking an intervention by and from America by Professor As'ad Abu Khalil. I'm afraid that we received a note that Ahdaf Suwaif is unable to be with us. She has to be, unfortunately, next to a relative in hospital in Egypt. She sends her apologies and wishes for success for this panel. And in order to try, of course, and I think that we have failed tonight in addressing gender balance issues, we will be nonetheless hosting Dr. Noha Elissa Tadrus-Khalaf with us. And certainly we are already delighted that he is with us from America, and we thank you all, our American friends, for waking up early for us. We have got with us the public intellectual, Dr. Kamal Khalaf-Al-Tawil, to deliver his vote of thanks at the end of this event. My lords, ladies and gentlemen, excellencies, without further ado, I am delighted to be having with us Professor Richard Falk, whom I am sure every one of you knows him very well, not only because he is a regular in our webinars, but because he himself is an internationally renowned academic and public intellectual. Professor Richard Falk is a leading scholar in international law, but no less he is a great scholar focusing on the Palestinian issue and Palestine. He has recently written and published the book Citizen Pilgrim, the life of actually a pilgrim, a public intellectual, the life of a citizen pilgrim. And we held for him an event here, which you can find and watch online. I'm truly delighted that Professor Richard Falk is here with us, and I am grateful that Professor Richard Falk was one of those first and pioneering supporters of the establishment of the Cambridge for Palestine Studies, and I am glad that he is with us tonight. So without further ado, Professor Falk, please kindly deliver your opening address at this webinar on the book of Professor Timothy Brennan about the life of the late friend of yours, Edward Said. The floor and the screen are yours.
Thanks so much for those kind words, Makram, and for bringing us together in this way. I'm actually honored to take part in this event celebrating the publication of Timothy Brennan's extraordinary biography of Edward Said. It also provides us with an occasion for considering once more Edward's powerful legacy as a creative and progressive icon, someone with a global reach, possessed of as passionate and challenging an ethical, cultural, and political conscience as I have ever had the good fortune to experience. I understand from Makram that my role tonight is to set the stage for the featured performer, somewhat similar to the warm-up given to the audience at a rock concert by an obscure local pop group before the acclaimed international star makes his or her dramatic appearance, and I will do my best. As I mentioned to Makram, I have two qualifications to be a speaker at tonight at this occasion. I once played tennis with Edward on Cambridge's exquisite grass court several decades ago. And more to the point, we were both often embattled due to supporting the struggle of the Palestinian people for a just and sustainable peace. Edward, more than anyone else on the American scene, exemplified what we understand to be a public intellectual in the late 20th and early 21st century. That is, after the death of Jean-Paul Sartre, who created the archetype public intellectual of our time. Such a role presupposes a degree of democratic governance that tolerates, even if only barely and reluctantly, ideas that challenge the most fundamental behavior of the state, captured in the spirit of the slogan, "Talking Truth to Power," which is somewhat less activist than Mario Savio's slogan that embodied the spirit of the 1960s, "Put your body up against the machine." One of the many achievements of Brennan's book is to do justice to the complexity and contradictory character of Said, who as a friend and colleague was at once engaging, paradoxical, theatrical, seductive, critical, provocative, and on occasion defensive, and of course gifted with a dazzling intelligence, a sparkling sense of humor, and of course stunning erudition. Edward was continually re-energized by his curiosity about all aspects of life and about the world, more than the few notable academics of my acquaintance with whom he might be compared, such as Noam Chomsky and Howard Zinn, and on the right, Samuel Huntington. Said alone was both a hero to the outsiders and a welcome guest among most insiders. And given his paradoxical style, he was often a commanding presence in both atmospheres that were often in sharp contention. Perhaps the secret of his personal magnetism and intellectual preeminence that he was at once a profound thinker and a consummate performer, a combination rarely found to inhabit the same body. Such was his charm and academic contributions that Edward was almost alone in being forgiven in Western elite circles for vigorously challenging the Zionist project and denouncing Israel's policies and practices. Brennan points out that Said was repeatedly offered jobs at Harvard and elsewhere that would have made his life easier. Yet although tempted, he never abandoned the edgy Manhattan atmosphere that he explored as an adolescent, possibly because he wanted to guard against succumbing to the alluring comforts and self-satisfactions of the more serene academic lifestyle that the Harvard-Cambridge scene offered. In his pre-activist days, he had tasted such serenity while a graduate student and earlier at Princeton, where he partook of the eating club social life. Perhaps nothing is more vividly revealing of Edward's love-hate relationship to the establishment in the United States that is discussed with the way in which Middle East studies were done at Princeton, undoubtedly prefiguring his most famous and influential rebuff to the disguised style of othering Arabs and others by way of his book and work on Orientalism. But despite this, Edward took a bemused delight that his two beloved children followed in his footsteps and received their undergraduate degrees at Princeton. Even after their graduation, Edward annually came and taught once a year my seminar, a high point for the students, and for me, a lesson in humility tinged with admiration and affection. As Timothy Brennan is such a warrior of ideas, himself working in the Said tradition, I'm not so foolish as to venture comments on Said's seminal work in literary and cultural studies, including music. My relations with Edward were during the last 25 years of his life, but it was for me an enriching friendship that centered on several personal connections and of course our shared commitment to an understanding of the Palestinian struggle and its obstacles. I met Edward by way of his greatest political friend, somewhat a mentor of third worldism, Iqbal Ahmed. Like Edward, Iqbal was a larger-than-life character who left an indelible impression on those he encountered, partly a result of his stage brilliance as a charismatic speaker before large audiences, and partly as a legendary professor at Hampshire College. Iqbal brought to Edward a vivid form of third world authenticity. Beyond this, they shared a theatrical and romantic sense of life as performance, excelling in its execution while exhibiting disciplined passion backed by a humane and humanistic worldview and a deep knowledge of their subject matter. Yet in some sense, both men were involuntary refugees of the spirit who never lost their existential sadness, having been deprived of their homelands of childhood, despite their quite different success stories in America. Both men died before fulfilling their core redemptive dreams. Iqbal's consuming wish of his latter years was to establish a quality university in Pakistan, in his native Pakistan, while Edwards was to experience directly a liberated Palestine. It was one of the great joys of my life to have been their friend and comrade over many years, somewhat sharing their strivings for societal, political, and personal fulfillment, where justice and love flourish and coexist. Brennan's book made me feel, despite our differences of religion, temperament, background, and talent, that my life was in illuminating respects a pale replica of Edward's illustrious life story, especially the choices we made in relation to Palestine, choices that crossed red lines of political propriety. I hope I'm not being overly self-indulgent when I nervously draw this comparison in bringing these remarks to a close. We were both products of privileged socioeconomic backgrounds, both shaped to a significant degree by the vivacities of New York City's cultural milieu, specifically Manhattan, both educated in preparatory schools. We both attended Ivy League universities and later earned doctorates at Harvard. and we both remained throughout long professional careers within the confines of the Ivy League. We were multiply linked to Princeton University and happened to write our most enduring books while visiting the Stanford Center for the Advanced Study of the Behavioral Sciences. And finally, and most significantly, we both endured defamation and threats because of our outspoken engagement with pro-Palestinian activism. There were also some irrelevant differences, none more stark than Edward as an ambivalent upper-class Christian and me as a nominal middle-class Jew. But of course, Edward's birth and experience of consciousness in Jerusalem and his Palestinian identity created a more natural vector for his political activism. Brennan brilliantly shows Said's oppositional sensibility pervaded all that he did, including eventually even his relationship to the Palestinian political establishment in Ramallah. My somewhat similar oppositional sensibility remains somewhat more locked in mystery, but like Edward, involves the frustrations and satisfactions of a resolve to swim against the current. And finally, I think as the years go by, of Edward's life becoming a more and more a fusion of his text to his life in a seamless whole. And no one has done this, no one has done more to bring this confluence to our sense of Edward and his work than Timothy Brennan, whose presentation I now look forward to experience in a form quite different from the valuable reading of his book. Thank you very much.
Professor Richard Falk, thank you very much for this incredibly personal yet professional opening address. We highly appreciate this. And now we are delighted to be having with us Professor Timothy Brennan, the author of the celebrated book. Please, of course, we shouldn't be reminding you to click and buy this, this incredible book. When I literally describe this book as an incredible and pioneering, and it is indeed the first comprehensive biography about Edward Said, I can only ask the author of this volume to present to us his journey. And I do welcome you, Professor Timothy Brennan. In fact, everybody can read about you, and we have sent and published the biographies of all participants. However, the most important achievement that I humbly can see is literally this incredible book. I was just yesterday talking to one of your contacts, Dr. Bayan Nuwayhib Al-Hout in Lebanon. And she told me, gosh, this is great news that he has published it. I'm delighted. And she said, well, he has been working on it for several years now. I can click now and see that we had corresponded in 2017. So first of all, Professor Brennan, congratulations on this publication, and the floor is yours, please.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. You know, one of the great privileges of writing a book like this is that you come to know people that you probably wouldn't have met otherwise, like Bayan Al-Hout, an amazing woman whose work I didn't know before I interviewed her, but which I learned about and have followed since. My thanks must go first to this marvelous introduction by Professor Richard Falk. I have never met you, but I've certainly followed your work and admired everything about it. So I'm just very humbled by the wonderful things that you said, but also more than anything, these personal comments that you make about the quite justified parallels between your own ventures into the public sphere and those of Edward. I think they were perfectly fitting, and it was really wonderful to hear them. Let me begin by saying how honored I am, obviously, that the Cambridge Center for Palestine Studies has organized a book launch like this. And so I want at the beginning to just thank all of the organizers of the event. I know how difficult it is, and I don't take the distinction lightly. It's been gratifying for me over the last 4 months or so, and also a little surprising to see the biography so widely reviewed and generating so much discussion, both in print and on air. After all, it's 20 years or so since Edward died, and I take all of this attention to be first and foremost proof of his legacy and how indelible, in fact, it is. I actually was a little reluctant when I was first approached by Edward's former New York literary agent, Andrew Wiley, to write this biography. And one of the reasons was that I wondered to myself whether people would still remember and still care. It seems obvious now, given the reception, that people do remember, and that they even feel that Edward's absence is missed very acutely, or rather his absence is felt very acutely. And I think that it means that people are hungry for or searching for new figures to pick up where he left off, carrying on his project as best they can, even if they cannot hope to do so, obviously, with his intellectual range and a brilliance I think it's fair to call symphonic. I thought I would use my 10 minutes here that I've been granted by addressing 2 questions. First, I would like to describe what, in my own mind, I was trying to do in this biography that I felt had not been done by others. And second, to mark some of the surprises I encountered when researching this book. That is, what I had not really expected to find about the Edward with whom I was personally and professionally involved for 2 decades. This man who was first a teacher, but then a friend, someone who would, just to give you a sense of our relationship, would bum cigarettes for me at conferences, would counsel me on my relationships, ask me to teach his classes when he was out of town, have me over for a glass of scotch, or in this case, right before he died, urge me to write an article defending him when he was attacked by Christopher Hitchens. So to approach the first question about what I hope my biography would uniquely offer, I should begin by stressing even, that there's a great deal of excellent work out there on Edward that's been published over the years. They certainly have taught me a great deal, and they've opened up to me sides of his character and ideas that I had not considered. To take only one recent example, let me mention here Mark Walhout's Arab Intellectuals and American Power, a book that has just come out, which explores a relationship I touch on as well, the intimate intellectual bond that existed between Edward and the right-wing Lebanese diplomat and intellectual Charles Malik. But I could mention other specialized studies of this sort as well, and the point I'm making here is simply that I do not think in the end that anyone can claim sole ownership over Edward's meaning, since that will always be a collective endeavor. Obviously, a full-dress biography has to tell a more global story. It cannot hammer away at a single idea or stake out a position of only one side. It has to draw also, obviously, on primary sources that others have never had access to. And in my case, that meant the testimony of eyewitnesses, many of them now dead, to Edward's life at every stage, his comrades in arms in Middle East politics, his childhood friends, and others. It meant also his looking at and reading over closely his extremely revealing student transcripts, where we can see for the first time the adolescent Edward expressing himself in his own words, as opposed to the heavily redacted version of that same boy in his memoir, Out of Place. It means also, of course, reading private correspondence and digging through the many materials found in archives at MIT, Stanford, Columbia, and elsewhere. As I gathered the information and sought to make sense of it, my idea was to show how the different dimensions of his character and project intertwined. This, I thought, was maybe the most important thing. We have already wonderful insights from academic theorists, say, about his role in changing the demographics and curricula of universities. But this, among Edward's many audiences, tend to know or care very little about his adventures in classical music, for example. Similarly, activists mired in the sectarian politics of the Middle East typically fixate on Edward's political role as a Palestinian spokesman, without really grasping how much of his rhetorical posture as a politician derived from his study of literature. We have those then that can speak to one part of him, but not the other parts, which calls into question whether you really know the part you think you do. What had not been done, in my opinion, was to show how his Arab and American selves came together, and the ways that Edward's writing on Palestine, music, public intellectuals, literature, and the media fed each other, and importantly, changed each other along the way. A theme then that runs throughout my book, and that perhaps I want most noticed, is this. Edward's success as a political analyst, a transformer of policies and a maker of movements, was very tightly bound up with his being a literary critic. And it was so as a matter of conscious plan on his part, as well as a very studied apprenticeship. In all of his endeavors, political, musical, literary, and as a media critic, he operated very much as a theorist of representation, narrative, and the image, translating those difficult concepts into a colloquial form. Being a literary critic and a theorist of continental philosophy was no early life detail, in other words, that he happily outgrew. It's what formed him politically and made his public interventions effective and memorable. I realized that even in an intellectual biography, one cannot tell the story of a man's ideas without telling us something about the man as a person in the world, especially someone as captivating as Edward. So it was always a balancing act, deciding how much to insert anecdotes and dramatic vignettes, character sketches, personal color, and so on. And there is, I think, a lot of that in the book. And how much, on the other hand, to stick to a narrative arc based on the drama of his ideas. I tried to deal with this problem by reminding myself that nothing mattered more to Edward himself than the mission and status of the intellectual in the pundit-ridden corporate world of Anglo-America. What it means to be an intellectual and how he became the one he was is therefore the most important thing to capture in any biography of Edward Said. If you don't do that, you're not being true to him, in my view, and you're missing the most durable thing about his legacy. One of his former students groused in a recent review that Edward's ideas are not what made him important, that many others had the same ideas. Rather, from his point of view, it was Edward's performative charm that mattered most. I find this view superficial, but also a kind of betrayal, and am surprised that someone as close to him in life as this former student would miss what made Edward of lasting importance, namely bringing the humanities to the center of the political discussion and embodying the image of the humanist intellectual as a guardian of the historical record and the creator of new social agendas. Let me now turn to the second question, the surprises I found when writing the book, and maybe this will give us something to talk about later. First, very few, including many of his closest friends and family, suspected that Edward wrote fiction, that he started 2 novels at different stages of his life, submitted a first-rate short story to The New Yorker, and published poetry. In fact, with close friends, he would often be asked why he didn't write fiction, and he would always answer somewhat deceptively, "What would I write about?" The fiction is important, not only because of what it reveals about the quality of his mind, the novelistic properties of his criticism and award-winning memoir, Out of Place, and the intimacy of his relationship to writing, but because he fought throughout his career against the common prejudice that poets and authors were primary, whereas critics were mere commentators on their work. He resolutely rejected this view, which was one of the reasons he did not in the end finish the novels. He spent his life arguing that the creative, political, and social impact of public intellectuals are at least as vital, if not more so, as that of authors of fiction. I think the drama of this conflict between writer and critic, embodied in his highly conflicted personality, is one of the most surprising and uncommented upon aspects of his work. Secondly, to take a more political angle, in my reading of the works of people in Said's orbit, and then piecing that together with interviews of his childhood friends and family, I discovered that the major career themes of Said's writing, including Orientalism, were inspired by the writings of the celebrated conservative, anti-Muslim Lebanese statesman Charles Malik, a friend of the family and the husband of his mother's cousin, Eva. This is an amazing story, given the principles. Malik was one of the authors with Eleanor Roosevelt of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. He was for a time the Secretary General of the UN, the Lebanese ambassador during the First Lebanese Civil War, who was involved in allying himself with John Foster Dulles and inviting US troops into the country. It is therefore rather absorbing that Edward, who stood for everything Malik hated, took his first leads as an impressionable teenager from an ardent Christian anti-communist. Edward, though, in another sense, shouldn't surprise us in this because he often dwelled on precursors he did not especially like, making them models for his future work. I'm thinking here of his writing on Joseph Conrad and Jonathan Swift, for example. In the case of Malik, he was drawn to the model of the intellectual who was also an active politician, and was so in order to turn it on its head and do for the left what Malik had done for the other side, as it were. To take a third example, when directly asked about religion, at least by his American and British readers, Edward would say he was an atheist. He also famously campaigned on behalf of what he memorably called secular criticism. I've been able to establish, I think, though, that his life was much more shaped by religion than he let on. And it was not just any religion, but Anglicanism, the religion of the British occupiers in the Cairo of his youth. His upbringing was saturated with Anglican hymns, the daily rituals of Mass, the Book of Common Prayer, for which he maintained an affection even in later life. His use of language, his self-conflicted relationship to English, and his love of and expertise in music could not have been unaffected by a childhood in which this religious musical routine was drummed into his mind. It is astounding that he has nothing to say about this in a writing career where autobiography played such a large role. It's an insight into one of the sides of Edward's life that he hid, or at least did not want to talk about. And I give my thanks to his sister Jean for pointing some of this out to me. Finally and lastly, it's simply not known how close Edward was to two Nobel Prize-winning novelists, Nadine Gordimer and Kensaburo Oe. And this is important because, again, it is tangible proof of the relationship of critic to writer in Said's life and thought, about the power of the former when measured against the latter. Gordimer was absolutely in love with Said's intellect and principles, and she wrote him long, revealing, very vulnerable letters, very much like fan letters, over a decade, that no one, to my knowledge, has ever written about or commented on. Their relationship was not at all romantic, of course, but it was way beyond cordial or admiring. They had a very special bond. A similar correspondence existed between Said and the Japanese novelist Oe. And parts of this moving correspondence were in fact published in a newspaper in Japan, but never to my knowledge in English. Both of them at separate times and in different ways say unambiguously that Edward's political essays and his general conduct as a speaker and advocate in the public sphere transformed their fiction and made them change, breaking them out of doldrums and opening up new paths of the imagination. I think this is a story that not very many know, and a lot of people would find fascinating as, again, visible testimony in his own life about what he had argued in his books, that the intellectual and critic often leads in the world of letters, where poets and novelists follow. Thank you for letting me speak. I'm now done, and I hope we can talk about some of this later.
Professor Timothy Brennan, thank you very much for this fascinating personal insight, which partly reminded me of Richard Falk's book when he mentioned in one of the chapters the very complicated relations between him, I mean Richard Falk, the late Edward Said, and Fuad Ajami. I think that because I am the chair and according to our regulations, I am not entitled to express any opinion. But if I may kindly call again for a couple of minutes only, Professor Richard Falk, if you don't mind, can you hear me, Richard? If you could unmute yourself, please.
Now,
yes. Yeah. I'm not sure if you heard me.
Yeah, I did. I heard you.
If I could kindly have your take, because you have obviously mentioned this complicated relations in your book, and this is the book of Richard Falk, and Timothy Brennan has just mentioned an astonishing fact about this very unique, let's put it, unique relationship between him and Charles Malik. Do you see any comparisons, Richard?
It was very, I noticed that in Timothy's book, he refers to Fuad on at least one occasion as a State Department intellectual, if I remember correctly, and as Edward's view of Fuad, a very derisive view, which I hadn't known. I was responsible for introducing Fuad to Edward. And if you know anything about Fuad Ajami's story, he was a very progressive person up until the Lebanon War, I believe, in '82. And his family had been a large landholder in southern Lebanon. I was responsible for bringing him to Princeton when he was a young and progressive scholar. And I introduced him to Edward and to Iqbal. And although there was some tension, there was, it reinforced what Timothy has been saying about Edward welcoming contestation with gifted people particularly, and Fuad was in his own way a brilliant person. I just say one more thing. I also broke with Fuad and had no friendship with him after he became a State Department intellectual. But I met him on the street in Washington one time, and we agreed to have coffee. And he said, the only thing I remember that he said was, Edward Said is trying to get me killed in the Middle East because he calls me an Uncle Abu, which was a sort of Arab equivalent of Uncle Tom. And I didn't know what to say. I hadn't heard that said before. I repeated it to Edward, who was amused, but didn't, I think, change the tenor of his remarks. I'm not sure he did say that or said it in an inflammatory way. He certainly wouldn't have intended any harm to Fuad. But it was an interesting trio. And Iqbal, who was always a reconciler, tried to make Edward and Fuad stay in contact despite the disparity, the gaping disparity of their views.
Thank you very much, Professor Richard Falk, for this comment, which I truly appreciate. You have expanded on a couple of points. I would like to perhaps, and I hope that I will be quoting it properly, Professor Brennan, if you could kindly follow my quotation. You have said, no one can claim a sole intellectual ownership of the legacy of Edward Said. I am sure you are aware, and now we will branch out a little bit to another speaker, of other intellectuals, academics who have got obviously different opinions, which we always welcome, because this is the way, or the only way, to generate knowledge. And recently, our team at the Cambridge Center for Palestine Studies have been researching, and I have to say, as you know, Professor Brennan, we have been infrequently working on this event for the last 3 months since, I think, the release of this book. And some of them brought us recently 3 articles, 3 sections of articles in Arabic about your book and about the late Edward Said. And we are pleased to say that this public intellectual and academic, who is an Arab Lebanese American, if he may excuse me or allow me to describe him as such, he is definitely possibly a weekly writer, quite creative and generous in his public comments, whether on Twitter or in Arabic, I have to say, leftist newspapers, very progressive newspapers. And he has kindly agreed to participate, take part in this discussion. And I am sure that you know that I'm talking about Professor As'ad Abu Khalil, who is with us. He's in America. We have got at least 3 speakers today from America, Professor Brennan, Professor Abu Khalil, and Dr. Kamal Khalaf-Al-Tawil. If you can hear us, I believe you can, Professor As'ad Abu Khalil. I'll be more than delighted, we shall be more than delighted if you could kindly shed light on your very unique angle when we discuss the book of our special guest today, Professor Brennan, and indeed the legacy of the late Palestinian-American intellectual and academic Edward Said. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I should say that I have read this book and enjoyed it a great deal. I read it the first time for my own purposes, and the second time because I'm writing a multi-part series about this book. I've written 3 already, and I have several in the making already. I should say that there is something to be said in praise of this book for sure. The author has made the story of Edward Said very interesting and gripping, something in line with the writings of Edward Said. I should also say that he's done an amazing job in the diligent research that he employed for the purpose of this book, and it showed. And to write about Edward Said, you're writing about different aspects of a man. Are you writing about the person in comparative literature? Are you writing about the person, the human, Edward Said? Are you writing about the political activist, or are you writing about the music critic? He addressed all of those with varying degrees of success. He certainly has done a greatest job in addressing Said in his own field of comparative literature. I think it fails more in the political aspect of this book, and this is what I focus my remark. I should say I cannot claim to have been a friend, a close friend of Edward Said. I was acquainted with him. I was one of the people he would sometimes call to vent political frustration with. I remember the longest phone call I had from him was on the day of the signing of the Oslo Agreement in the White House. And he was furious. And I remember he called me and he couldn't believe how things were. And I should also say that like Professor Brennan, I was asked by Edward once to write a scathing long article against Kanaan Makkiya in defense of Edward Said. And I've done that to Edward's satisfaction. And I remember the last email I received from him was, he told me very briefly, I am sorry, I've been busy lately with writing and dying. And that's the last words I heard from Edward. And I kept thinking as I read this book and rereading it, how would Edward feel about this book? And I felt there are a lot of things that he would like, but there are certain things that are problematic, and they are largely on the political. I feel that he was swayed, and this is where Edward would not have been happy. Brennan, because of his, we should not expect him to be a Middle East expert because he's not. And we should not expect him to read Arabic, Persian, or Middle East languages because he doesn't. But I think he should have interviewed more people and different people. Why is it that he seems to be swayed by opponents of Sa'id, less by supporters of Sa'id? He said that the person who navigated Arab politics for him in Lebanon is a Syrian opposition figure whose political agenda is totally antithetical to that of Sa'id, or that he was so influenced by Sadiq al-Azam. And I cannot think of a person that Edward more despised and had contempt for than Sadiq al-Azam. The only other person would be in competition would be Fuad Ajami. And I should say, with my own personal story with Edward, the first time I met him in 1984, I was still a fresh graduate student at Georgetown University, and he came to the Institute of Policy Studies in Washington to give a talk. And I was furious with him because he gave a talk and he spoke against the armed struggle by the Palestinians. And I come from a leftist background, and I was very unhappy. And we clashed strongly at that event. But within 2 years, there was a reconciliation between us because I wrote a scathing review of Fuad Ajami's second book, and he was very much happy with that. And with both, contrary here, I want to correct what Professor Falk said. Sa'id was extremely unwilling to reconcile with any of those two men. In 1992, when Sadiq al-Azam was a scholar at the Wilson Center, and Edward, it came to his attention that him and I were meeting for coffee and so on, and he was very unhappy about that. And he called me, and he was telling me about what Sadiq al-Azam was doing in America, and he was correct, that he was sponsored by the Zionists at Princeton, that they were the one who brought him to America just to spite Sa'id and so on. And he was correct, given the political trajectory of Sadiq al-Azam towards the end of his life, something that Brennan does not mention in any way. We can safely say that Sa'id was very prophetic in his early perception about the project of Fuad Ajami and of Sadiq al-Azam. So this is what I feel it was swayed. And this is why, whether in the review by Adam Schatz or other reviews I've read, I noticed many of them are using Sadiq al-Azam against Sa'id. And I worry about that aspect of the book very much. I should also say that Professor Brennan missed the Arab reception of Sa'id. He did it even today in his presentation when he said that in the Arab world, he was only seen for his political activism, but not for his literary writings. But Professor Brennan, how would you know that? You don't read Arabic, you don't follow Arab political debates. And I'm here to tell you that is patently false. In fact, in the Arab world, they clamor to all the writings of Sa'id, political or non-political alike. And you have to see the plethora of books that are written about Sa'id, collection of his articles, interviews throughout the Arab world, and they are among the bestsellers. The second section is, and this is where it's significant, is that he seems to imply to the reader, so unfair to Sa'id and so unfair to all the Arab people in the world, as if Edward Said was hated by Arabs, as if people were plotting to assassinate him. And I don't know where he got that impression from. At one point, he said when Edward was spending the academic year in 72, 73 in Beirut, that there were attempts on his life by virtue of a comment he made against car bombings. To that, I say, in 72, 73, Professor Brennan, nobody has heard of Edward Said in the Middle East. Nobody knew who he was. Second, if he made a comment about car bombing, why would Arabs be upset about that? Up to that point, the only ones who resorted to armed bombings were, before the establishment of the State of Israel, were Zionist gangs in Palestine, and later on by the State of Israel. And now we know from the book Rise and Kill by Bergman is that Israel was behind the most car bombings in Lebanon. And then he says that some of Said's friends were assassinated, and that's why he was worried. Who are these friends who were assassinated? Who assassinated him? They were by Israel, not by some angry Arab or angry Lebanese people. Means these were his friends like Kamal Nasser, who was assassinated, or Abu Omar, Hanna Mikhail. And even with reference to the murder of Abu Omar, Brennan says that he died in mysterious circumstances, thereby implying as if some shady Arab group was behind it. Professor Brennan, Abu Omar, along with some Palestinian activists, were on their way from Beirut to Tripoli. The entire maritime route was controlled by the Israeli army and by its client militias, the Lebanese forces. They were the ones who behind the murder of this group. So that's one thing I wanted to point out. Certainly, Edward Said was debated, but for much of his life, he was beloved in the Arab world. I can even say this to Professor Brennan. There is no Arab intellectual I know of today who is supported and cited by secular leftists and by Islamists alike like Edward Said. There's nobody. If you mention somebody like Adonis, he's loved by some liberals, some leftists, but he's hated by Islamists. Edward Said was beloved by all these different political currents. And certainly, Edward Said's political trajectory has changed dramatically over the years, much more than is portrayed in the book. I mean, I just want to give one example. For example, the name of Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah, does not appear once in the book. And I'm here to say, as a leftist who came from Lebanon, in the 1990s, I was very critical of Hezbollah because we were the left that was defeated. And in our stead, there rose a new political grouping that were Islamists and so on. So me and others were not happy about that. And I remember Edward Said and Clovis Maqsoud were in the 1990s trying to persuade me to get over my animus towards Hezbollah and to say that there is a historic role being played in South Lebanon. And Edward was a huge fan of this example. And he sought to meet with Nasrallah, which he did. And you make no mention of that historic meeting in this book. I will say even further than that. Edward Said politically changed dramatically over the years. And I think perhaps you talked more to English-speaking people than to Arab-speaking people. That was missing. I mean, I mentioned to the audience, the first time I met him, I clashed with him in 1984 at IPS in Washington, D.C. In 1992, in the fall, when I was debating Judas Miller in New York City, and Edward was very excited about that event, and he came to watch that debate. And after the debate, when we were walking together outside the street, he told me, you know, over the years, these are his words, over the years, I find me, and I'm translating verbatim here, I find me getting closer to your folks. He was telling me, basically he was referring, he was politically getting closer to the views of people like followers of George Habash. And that was who he meant. And we see that towards the end of his life, he was categorically against the two-state solution. And I think that is also missing. I mean, in the 1970s, he was more for the two-state solution. He was sympathetic to the DFLP. And again, in reference to the DFLP, Professor Brennan really missed the point about that. And he sometimes confused it with the PFLP. And he even mentioned the DFLP was not communist when it was a very hardcore Stalinist communist organization that was the most subservient to the USSR. The section about Charles Malik also made me uncomfortable, to be honest with you. Charles Malik had a family relationship to the Said family, we know that. Edward had a relationship with Charles Malik for sure. But I think you misportrayed Charles Malik. You did now in the introduction refer to him as a politician intellectual. He was not even a politician. The only term he served in parliament was in 1957 because the CIA back then arranged for the election of supporters of Camille Chamoun and John Foster Dulles' people in Lebanon. That's how he became MP. He never once succeeded in winning an election. In 1957, there was a famous election with cash payments to MPs and so on, and the electoral districts were drawn by Chamoun. Very, very famous story. And by the way, he was not president of the General Assembly, like you said. He was not the Secretary of General Assembly. He was president of the General Assembly in one session of the Security Council. Charles Malik's role in the drafting of the Charter of Human Rights Charter, I think, was exaggerated. It was mostly the work of the US government, as we know. In fact, Charles Malik, we know from the account, wanted to invoke more references to God and the Creator, and there were objections from the Chinese delegate who also played part in that. But Edward Said, over the years, despised Charles Malik, despised what he represented, and despised the political grouping to which he belonged. I mean, Charles Malik, and there's a new dissertation, by the way, just completed at Rice University by the new young brilliant scholar Nate George, in which he sheds new light about Charles Malik and his ties to the Israelis, something that was missing from Brennan's references. I mean, we know from the public record that in 1951, he visited the Israel section in the New York World Fair. And this was a huge cause célèbre in Lebanon. And there was a lot of recrimination about it and so on. And in the Civil War, he was one of the sponsors, one of the theorizers of the alliance with the Israeli occupation state. So this is the Charles Malik that is missing. At one point, Brennan talks about that Charles Malik had a project for Arab humanism. How could Charles Malik had a project about Arab humanism when he did not believe of anything called Arab? I mean, Professor George Saliba from Columbia University now at AUB told me the story when he was about to embark on his PhD studies in the United States in the history of Islamic science. Charles Malik took him aside and said, why do you study Islamic science? Arabs and Muslims know no science. Go study something else. So that's the real Charles Malik. The second, one other item I want to mention about that in the short period of time that I have is that references to Yehoshua Harkabi, Professor Brennan. If I were to think of something that would have bothered Edward in this book, I would say your laudatory, almost fawning references, romanticizing an Israeli war criminal. This is Yehoshua Harkabi, who was head of military intelligence, who, and you cited Chomsky, said that he used to send letter bombs to the people in Gaza to smash the resistance in Gaza. Yehoshua Harkabi wrote a book in 1971 called Arab Attitudes to Israel, which you cite approvingly. Professor Brennan, are you aware what role that book played in Zionist propaganda in the world for many years and decades? Are you aware that this book basically painted the Palestinian national movement as a twin movement of Zionism? Are you aware, Professor Brennan, that this book, Arab Attitudes to Israel, was a precursor to that notorious organization known as Memory, which basically cataloged any words of hate by Arabs anywhere in the world? This book, you talk about it this way. You say that Harkabi dissected the Arab psyche. Just think about that phrase you coined, Professor Brennan. How would have Edward reacted to that phrase? That you invoke the term Arab psyche? I mean, is this not like the invocation of the thesis of Raphael Petal? It is for this reason I feel there was a certain betrayal to the message of Edward and his legacy in the way that there was an invocation of the work of Yehoshua Harkabi. I mean, that's something very strong. I also want to say about the relationship between Edward Said and armed struggle. I mean, I would say that there was a time in his life when certainly Edward believed in a peaceful resolution, a two-state solution. But I would say it would be inaccurate, given the anecdote I just told in the 1990s with him and Clovis Maqsoud were trying to have me tone down my rhetoric in criticism of Hezbollah and so on. Edwards believed in the right of the Arabs to resist Israeli occupation. And he certainly was not opposed to military resistance to Israel. I also want to say that there are certain things about the book that talks about Edward in a way as if his relationship with the Palestinian cause was rather abruptly begun in the mid-1970s, when it really began earlier. Like you say in the book, for example, that he only met PLO leader in 1974. In fact, he met them earlier. In an article which is published in English in Al-Ahram Weekly, he tells the story when he wrote about Abu Omar that he met Yasser Arafat, in fact, back in 1969 in Jordan. So Edward had a very early fascination with the Palestinian armed struggle. He wanted to meet these movements. And when you talk about the important decision in his life, when he wanted 1974, and he corresponded with Kosti Zuraik so that he would get a job at the American University of Beirut, which treated Edward so shabbily. And you tell that story well, by the way. the American University of Beirut, to its eternal shame, treated Edward so shabbily when he was volunteering to be of help to them. But this is not surprising about a university which turned down a job application by Ahmed Zuwail, the Egyptian fellow, who later won the Nobel Prize, because they did not like that he went to Alexandria University for his undergraduate. So Edward, despite how he was mistreated by AUB, offered to work full-time in 1974, which was interestingly the same year that Hisham Sharabi was planning to leave Georgetown to go back to Beirut to work at the American University of Beirut. But of course, things did not transpire. And you mentioned Miriam was not happy with that decision, and later he went back to Columbia and so on. But his connection with the cause was much earlier. I mean, it was even earlier than Edward would let us believe. Like Edward often spoke about 1967, how it was a watershed in his life and so on. And that's reprinted in Politics of Dispossession. But I think from your book, and you did a good job in that, you researched his private writings and so on. And we find that even when he was a student, he was totally consumed with Arab politics. He was sympathetic to Nasser, just as his mother was, and so on. So, and this is what I believe the texture of the personality of Edward comes through in Arabic that doesn't come through in the book. I mean, Edward was somebody who really was keen to speak in Arabic to Arabs. I don't recall he spoke to me in English at all, for example. And I remember him commenting about a Lebanese student at Columbia to the effect that what's wrong with that student who, if you greet him in Arabic, he answers you in English. So he was very sensitive to this. And I think that his Arabism over the years, very much like many Arab intellectuals in America, like Hisham Sharabi, Hanna Batatu, became much more Arabized towards the end of their life. They were more at peace with Arab culture and so on. Like, for example, Edward, towards the end of his life, Timothy does not mention that, by the way, in the book. He really watched Arabic TV and was watching much less of the English American channel that he used to watch. I mean, he was a close follower of Al Jazeera, for example, when it came and so on. So in conclusion, I don't want to take much more time. I want to say that certainly this book is definitive biography of Edward Said and will be for years to come by virtue of the hard work that was put by Brennan in its writing. However, there is something missing in the presentation of the person of Edward Said and a bit of his legacy. I mean, there is certainly a book which I'm also going to be talking about in my writings by Dominique Iddi, which, and I feel Brennan dismissed Dominique Iddi too quickly about her knowledge with Said. I would say that I definitely did not like her book whatsoever, and I felt it was so bitter against Edward, and he certainly would have been very unhappy with it, even though I'm not here to speak on his name. But I would say that Dominique Iddi knew Edward as a person much more than you or I knew him. And in that context, I feel that the biography of Said should have taken into consideration her book about Edward. But I think that we need to introduce to American Western audiences, since you're writing in English, the Arab dimension of Said and the Arab perception and attitudes to him that were far more favorable, far more endearing than was let on in your book. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Asad Abu Khalil, for this very distinct opinion and contribution. No doubt, we always welcome a free debate. You have mentioned many points, frankly, which need perhaps another session in order to collate, rehash, and analyze all the points you have mentioned. And you also mentioned, Professor Asad Abu Khalil, the PLO and Edward Said's relations with the PLO. And on this note, we are delighted to have with us a Palestinian academic, a lady who in fact got her PhD from INALCO in Paris, but also knew Edward Said, but as well as she was a PLO ambassador. And she lived in Beirut, was in Beirut, and she has got, I believe, quite a few things to tell us, in addition to the fact that she is an academic and quite a sharp analyst. So we are delighted to be having with us Her Excellency Dr. Noha Al-Isa Tadrus-Khalaf, I can see you smile, Dr. Noha. You only need to unmute yourself. If you could unmute yourself, and then we can...
I'm smiling about Her Excellency, because that is old history, and I don't identify too much with... Can you hear me?
I can hear you, but we have to...
Yeah, and I don't identify too much with that title, nor with the period in which I worked as with the PLO, which was until maybe the beginning of the 1980s. And thank God I was not anymore working as an ambassador when the Oslo Accords took place, because I was, like Edward Said, totally against the Oslo Accords. So anyway, I'm happy that I have retired so I can take over again what I should have been since a long time, which was a pure, not a pure or a Gramscian intellectual or something of the sort. Of course, in this debate, I'm a minority, first as a woman, and second as someone who is not living in the United States. Although I was in New York for a short time, for 2 years at the United Nations mission, and we had a common conference called The Road to Peace in 1989 in New York, where Edward, Abu Lughod and Rashid Khalidi and all of them were present. It was maybe one of the first times that there was this conference, a meeting between Jewish and Arabs in New York. And there were 3 groups: the American intellectuals, the Arab American intellectuals, and the American Jews of New York, and some people from the PLO, which I was at that time one of them. Anyway, this was a very interesting conference. I don't know if you all know about it. That was before the Oslo Accords. And it was a trial to see how things would work between some Jewish leftists and Palestinian, whether they were intellectuals in America or PLO people. Well, I want to go back to the question of the reason why I joined this conference, when I told Makram that I had written a piece about Edward's Out of Place in particular, because I had worked my PhD thesis about the memoirs of Elissa, who's one of the first journalists in Palestine. And because of that, I went through a lot of sources about what writing a memoir means. And then I put the question in my mind, which is why Edward, after having written Orientalism and culture and imperialism and very intellectual books, why did he go through writing Out of Place, which is not at all in the same line than his intellectual works? And I wrote a piece called The Anthropological Quest for Identity. And it is through this article, which I only published on internet, because I'm away from American IV, I'm just isolated in the Arab world. So I published it as an anthropological quest for identity. And I found many points which coincide with what Mr. Brennan, Dr. Brennan has said in his book about Edward Said, although I find that in his book, Out of Place, he has condensed, especially in the introduction and the end of the book, the main ideas that are recurrent in your book about, but you have not mentioned that he said it clearly, or maybe I did not read the book till the end, when he says, I found I had 2 alternatives which I had to counter, because he found that he was not totally Arab. His name was Edward and Said, and he always had a problem with this double People were telling him, Edward, so you are not Arab. Sa'id, so you are Arab. So he suffered from this dual identity. And this is how he started Out of Place, about the question of his duality. And interestingly, there's a small point which says, I wish I was all Arab or all Muslim or all Christian or all Orthodox. And here I will point to Makram, that being an Anglican in the Middle East is also a minority within the Christian Orthodox majority. So Edward was suffering actually from a number of alienations in the Middle East. The Orthodox Arabs, they think that they are Arabs, but the Anglicans are always viewed as Anglo as the result of missionary teaching in the Middle East. And this is where maybe he got his workaholic, ethics, the Protestant ethics of hard work, which we do not have in the Middle East in general. Anyway, I would like to add a point to what As'ad Abu Khalil has said. I was surprised that there was no mention, that actually I looked at the footnotes. You mentioned Mahmoud Darwish as a passing by fleeting personality who met Edward on several occasions. In fact, there is a very important poem written by Mahmoud Darwish about Edward Said, which is called Contrapunctuality. And it is a beautiful poem. It is very badly translated into English, so I started fixing it. And he met Edward 2 years before Edward died. And it's a very, very important poem where it shows that Mahmoud Darwish, the greatest Palestinian poet, had understood exactly the dilemma of Edward Said. At the same time, he identified totally with him as two Palestinians displaced and had left Palestine in 1967 and joined the PLO. So he met Mahmoud twice. Once he says 30 years ago, and the second time when he wrote his poem was 2 years before Edward Said passed away. And it's a very interesting and long poem which shows the relationship between Edward Said, who was one of the brightest intellectuals in Palestinian perspective, and Mahmoud Darwish, who is one of the most renowned and best poets we have ever had. He's mentioned everywhere. Every day someone mentions Mahmoud Darwish because of it. The end of the poem is very interesting because he says, what if I die before you? Darwish, Edward says, what if I die before you? In fact,
Noha, can I just ask you, please, not to move your hands and papers because they are, in a sense, distracting the sound, please. Your sound. No, you have, Noha, you have muted yourself. Yes,
everybody should read it. Yeah,
it's fine.
Actually, I wrote an article about it in one of my articles that I publish in Arabic. And this is a footnote, but there is a very big problem, a distance between what is written in the West and what is written in the Arab world. And it's something that I suffer personally from because I feel there is a misunderstanding and a lack. It's not a misunderstanding, it's lack of knowledge, total lack of knowledge of what is being written. And I'm not addressing this to Professor Brennan, but in general. And it's a very interesting discussion they have had because he says, Edward, if I died before you, I shall entrust you with the impossible, to Mahmoud Darwish. And so Darwish tells him, is it a long way off? He says, a generation away. I say, and if I die before you, Darwish tells Sa'id. So Sa'id replies, I shall console the mounts of Galilee, and I shall write, beauty is merely the accomplishment of what befits it. And then he says, when I visited the new Sodom, because he calls the West Sodom, when I visited the new Sodom in the year 2002, Sa'id was resisting against the war of Sodom against the people of Babylon and fighting cancer at the same time. He was the last epic hero who defended Troy's right to its share of the story. Eagle, he was soaring high, bidding farewell to his mountain peaks. Since residing above Olympus and the summits, boredom, living in the summits triggers boredom, so farewell, farewell, poetry of pain. But this is the last 3 words. It's a long poem where there is a lot of identifying between Edward Said and Mahmoud Darwish. So I shall suggest maybe that it should be read and analyzed, and it is part of what Professor As'ad Abu Khalil was saying about the role of Edward Said in the Arab world. I mean, for a big poet like Mahmoud Darwish to go and meet Edward 2 times and write a poem for Edward proves that the link between the Palestinians. I have a question to Professor Brennan about the title of the book. Now, it's a very impressive title, but I would like to know what you mean by place of mind. I have worked a lot on the question of place. And in France, actually, there is a word which is not translatable about place. It's called lieu, lieu and place, but lieu is a place with meaning. So, and a very famous French anthropologist wrote place, there's a place, lieu, and non-lieu. I mean, you can be in a lieu or in an out of place, which is place and out of place. Places of mind needs a bit of I mean, are they imaginary places or real places? Because when you say places of mind, it might mean that they do not exist as real places. Another point is that Edward Said said that an intellectual is like a drowning man. And in this, he is similar to other French philosophers. I think that Edward Said was very much influenced by French philosophy, and you show it. I mean, his debates with Foucault and others, and I think that's why he worked a lot on the role of the intellectual, and he gave his conferences at the Collège de France, which were published through different titles, I think. Many essays were compiled in his book, The Intellectuals and Power, Les Intellectuels et le Pouvoir in French. So his understanding of an intellectual as a drowning man. Another question is about Anwar Abdel Malik, who used to be also my professor. And there is some ambiguity about whether Anwar Abdel Malik, what Anwar Abdel Malik had written about Orientalism. And you mentioned that Edward Said was angry that Anwar Abdel Malik did not refer to him, and both ways. I did not manage to find the article by Anwar Abdelmalik about Orientalism, which precedes Edward's book. But anyway, and also because I was interested in his memoirs, in why did he write Out of Place? It was to talk about this duality, which you mention a lot in your book, throughout the book, you know, that on several occasions, even his first wife was telling him, there's not only the duality of being Arab and American, but also of being a linguist and a critic and a poet, and his attempts to write novels. So maybe Out of Place is a way for him to write his own novel. I mean, his story. Since he refused before, or he stopped, he had tried and not completed his writing of the story. So I think there are many points to be discussed in your book. It sounds very much like Richard Falk's public intellectual book. So in this sense, when you read it, you think of Edward as an American, more than Edward as an Arab. And I think he really was more American. I mean, why should we not say the truth? I mean, he is an American intellectual. I am not. If my father had accepted to send me to America when I was 17, my life would have been different. But anyway, when you live in America, when you work in Colombia, when you meet distinguished people like Falk and all the other people mentioned in the book, apparently, so did you mean place of mind? Palestine was only a place of mind and not a real place for him. It is a place of his childhood. Now, as all of you spoke a little bit about their relationship with Edward Said, I would like to say that I have many points in common with Edward Said because I lived a period of my life in Egypt, and for a long time there was, by intermittent relations, you know, with his family and our family and so on. And this story of Egypt is also a very sad story because the people of his mother's generation, they had this total amnesia about their being Palestinian. First of all, maybe because the dislocation was so strong that they did not want to remember what happened. And also because in Egypt, they were called Shawam. They were labeled within a large category of people who came from Sham, and you didn't know who was Palestinian, who was Syrian, who was Lebanese. And so this is also a very important point in his life, that even in Egypt, they were not considered Palestinians. Yeah, the other thing is that he wrote a piece, I think in Al-Ahram, about the hazards of writing a memoir, which was, he said, I hope that my memoir would be read after I was dead. But actually, it was published before he died. So he talks about Don Quixote and being some kind of Don Quixote, and compares himself to other people who wrote memoirs, you know, like Rousseau, and says that for an Arab to write his memoir in this way is something that was unprecedented, except with Taha Hussein, who had written some kind of a memoir with real implications about his personal life, whereas most of the other Arab memoirs were very much like, you know, political or, you know, just talking about family and so on, and nothing personal. So this was an interesting article on the hazards of writing a memoir, and of also the importance of the figure of the intellectual as a drowning man. and of even the intellectual starting to like the question of exile, you know, like a masochist who started at the end to enjoy the pains of exile. It's very important that he has produced he talked a lot about exile, and this is a very important point for Palestinians as an intellectual or academic concept, exile and the role of the intellectual. Anyway, thank you. I have other questions, but maybe you should, go ahead with your presentation.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Noha Elissa Tadrus-Khalaf.
Well, the name also is a combination of identities.
Yes, but it's very important that you are who you are. And to me, at least, as someone who was born in Jaffa, your Yafawi connection with Isa al-Isa, because you are his granddaughter, yeah. In any case, thank you very much, Noha, for this intervention and indeed for a few superb questions. We would like, of course, to give the opportunity to Professor Timothy Brennan to respond to all these comments that were mentioned, but whilst I am not entitled to express any opinion, I just found that in page 321 in Professor Brennan's book, he addresses actually one of the points that I think Professor Asad Abu Khalil thought that he did not address it, which is about the Oslo Accords, one state, two state solutions. And I think that there is a discussion there in page 321. But in any case, Professor Timothy Brennan, the floor and the mic are yours, please.
Thank you very much. I wanted maybe just to answer first the most recent questions by Noha Khalaf about the phrase, first of all, places of mind. The tragedy or the condition, let's say, of being Palestinian, at least in part, as Edward himself tried to express so eloquently in After the Last Sky, this photo text collage he did with Jean Moore, is to not physically be in a place, in fact, to be prevented from being in a place that one nevertheless has this projected identity with and in. So a lot of the poetic reflections in this wonderful photo text collage are hammering away at this kind of point, that one is not physically in the place that one imagines and wants to be in and feels themselves imaginatively to be in. It's this kind of idea that I think also Mahmoud Darwish really gets at wonderfully in his poem An Exile's Letter, which gets at precisely this kind of point. So partly the idea is to, foreground the well-known disparity between the places that Said physically occupied for much of his life, which was primarily New York, at least as a base, with Beirut being his second home, and the place that was what he imaginatively and politically wrote about. So I think that that's one of the things that's lying behind this title. The other thing I'm doing, though, is two other things are really contained there. And of course, it wouldn't really be clear to someone unless they'd read the book, my biography, and read it closely. And that is that Edward took the position very often throughout his career that the emphasis in leftist intellectual circles for the longest time had been on history and time. And he found it much more liberating somehow and more politically cogent to talk about geography and land and space. So this emphasis throughout his life on geography versus the temporal issue, that colonialism is in the end about the occupation of land, and there is only so much land on the face of the earth, that I wanted to strike that note, that there was a kind of a geographic imagination in Edward that was consistent throughout his life. The other idea is that Edward was often taken to be by members of the left, criticized, in fact, very harshly by members of the left, including his close associate Sami al-Banna, an activist in the struggle that I drew heavily on as a kind of informant, somebody who both knew Said personally but was involved in the politics of the Middle East, that he was an idealist, that he didn't think in terms so much of the ultimate determinations being political economics. He thought in terms of ideas being what led people to do certain things, that the war that he was fighting was one conducted very much in narrative, in the projections of an image, and that these ideas are what actually lead people. They have material consequences. They're not reflecting reality, they're a part of reality. And he keeps making this point in various ways in book after book after book. So that was the other reason that I used it. You mentioned Anwar Abdel Malik. I think, you know, the relationship between them was actually very warm and cordial. And I raised him primarily in the book because I wanted to fend off the, to me, unjust criticisms that Edward had taken liberally from people who had written about Orientalism before him and had done so without proper acknowledgement. And I was trying to show that that was not true, and that indeed he had this intellectual relationship with Abdel Malik and admired him greatly and took from him. In fact, praised him deeply and personally. Why did he write out of place? I think your hunches are absolutely correct. I think he did it as a substitute for finishing the novel that he was then working on. It was a genre similar, but not the same as the novel, similar to, but not the same as the novel, that was a more appropriate vehicle, he came to feel, for getting across the kind of things he thought the novel would accomplish, which is to give people a tactile feeling of what it meant to grow up in Cairo and to be politically active in Beirut. And that's what he wanted to evoke for people. And he does partially in this memoir. The memoir is, of course, as brilliant as it is, as wonderful as it is, it's filled with silences that I think I go to great pains, whether successfully or not, you can judge, to speak out on. That is, there's all kinds of gaps and fissures. He says almost nothing about his sisters. He portrays his father in a way that isn't borne out by the documents. And there's lots of things that I could go into in detail that I think Edward, for whatever reason, either misremembers or gets wrong or doesn't want to talk about. And so there's this maybe corrective aspect about that. But the other thing about the memoir, let's not forget, is that it ends when he's in college. You know, so it prevents him from having to talk about his failed first marriage and what is arguably the most interesting parts of his life. So you know, that can only be covered not in his memoir, but in a biography or what other people might write in the future. That he comes off, you say, more as an American than an Arab in this book. If that's the case, then I've failed in that respect, because although Edward certainly was based in America and was an American, in fact, as you know, even from birth he was an American, as I point out, and therefore his base of operations was American. Therefore, there's going to be a lot of things in the book that are going to come off and register as American. But I think I try anyway to go to great depths to explain to people that he identified as an Arab, that, you know, as Professor Abu Khalil was pointing out, that, you know, he speaks to Arabs in his acquaintanceship wherever he is in Arabic. And this was a very important thing for him. This is his identity, and this is how he felt. And he made no secret of it around all of us, including non-Arabs like myself. So the other side of it, though, is, and this is important, right, that for all of this training, for example, this apprenticeship that he was involved in the, you know, the intellectual legacies of the Noha, you know, I mean, he's not just that he feels himself to be an Arab, he is trying to train himself in the thinking of the Arab intellectuals that preceded him. He sees himself as operating in that constellation of thinkers. This is one of the major points I think I'm trying to make, and it's a very important point for me. So if that didn't properly get across, then I apologize for that, but that is really my intention. His son, you know, Wade did point out to me that there were some paradoxes in these trips that he would take to the Middle East when things opened up more to the occupied territories, that he usually went there under, you know, certain auspices. He's making a film, and so they're highly scripted encounters of very short duration in which he's giving talks places and so on. What he didn't do, and what, you know, Wade himself did do, is go back and actually stay there for a year And so he's really having to be informed about life, day-to-day life in contemporary Palestine by his son and others that his son puts him in contact with, because he doesn't himself know. There is this distance. So anyway, I think that kind of deals with some of your questions. About the harsh criticisms offered by Professor Abu Khalil, I just want to say that, you know, if indeed I were guilty of saying some of the things that he thinks I said, I would be upset too. I don't know really what the problem is, but, you know, maybe it's a question of the different fields that we're in, or maybe it's a question of different strategies of reading, or maybe I was just being too subtle. But some of the things that are attributed to me here are simply not in the book. I don't know how else to put it. I'm not at all more swayed by Edward's opponents than his allies. There's abundant testimony that I've gotten in the interviews of his supporters, precisely to set the record straight against his opponents. So I certainly don't take the word of Sadiq al-Azam as a gospel truth in the war against Edward. I think I made it very clear that that was a very close relationship that went sour when Sadiq al-Azam attacked him in the most vicious ways, including accusing him of being a collaborator with the United States. I mean, I couldn't possibly be taken, I think, as supporting Sadiq al-Azam in such a charge, and I don't. I think that there's a problem repeatedly in the comments made of misreading and misattribution and misquotation. How, I'm asked, do I know about Edward's reception in the Arab world? Well, I mean, quite simply, the way I know anything that I talked about in the book, by researching it, by interviewing people who are, unlike myself, specialists in Middle Eastern politics. I don't know if you're aware of it or not, but there are two fantastic anthologies. One put out by Ferial Khazul from the American University of Cairo through the journal Aleph, which she edits, as you I'm sure know. It's a marvelous 2-volume compendium of individual specialist articles on various aspects of Said's work and legacy. And among the articles found there in that invaluable collection are works by people who specifically address his reception in the Arab world. They're very detailed and very helpful. A similar anthology of that sort by Adel Iskander and Hakem Rustam is filled with wonderful books, wonderful articles of that sort, one of them by a former colleague of his, Ella Shohat, whose work you might know in this respect. So I do agree that I'm not a specialist in Middle East politics, and that is what made me, as a specialist on Edward Said's life and work, to appeal to the knowledge of those who were, and I do, repeatedly. I don't really understand why you would think for a moment that my references to Yehoshaphat Harkabi were fawning. I mean, they're anything but. This dissection of the psyche is a phrase that I'm using, and I think it's very clear in context, given what Edward said about the dissection of Arab psyches in Orientalism, because it's in that chapter that the phrase can be found, that I'm saying that phrase, I'm writing that phrase with contempt for what he's doing. In fact, I think I say very clearly that along with Patai, Harkabi was the kind of locus classicus in the contemporary moment of exactly the Orientalist attitudes that Edward so effectively explodes in his famous book. So no, I don't agree that a fair reader of what I've written would take me to be fawning about Harkabi. A lot of the other comments made, I think, fall roughly into this kind of category. I mean, did Edward despise Charles Malik? Well, yes. I mean, how could he not? He kind of defined himself in antithesis to Harkabi. Everything about the confessional politics that Malik espoused made him an early opponent of kind of a knee-jerk anti-communism, which he symbolized, as well as the anti-Muslim attitudes that he pronounced. I mean, but here's the thing, right? I mean, are you attentive enough to contradiction, right? To the fact that Edward was, in some of his desires and attitudes and intellectual positions, sort of famously perverse in a way, right? That he was in fact drawn to those that he disliked or disagreed with while attempting to learn from them. I don't think that it similarly can really be said that that Charles Malik is not an important intellectual or an important political figure in the Arab world. I mean, he studied with Alfred North Whitehead, and he studied with Heidegger, and he talks about these things in his books. He is a humanist. He does talk about Arab humanism. If you're not aware of that, I can show you the books in which he does. Did he hate Malik, Edward? Yes, he did. But Malik was, in fact, maybe precisely for that reason, somebody that he also absorbed, learned from, and attempted to turn on its head. Some of the things that you're holding me to account for are things that I myself say in the book. So you're often pointing out details as though they weren't there in the book, and they're exactly there. You're just repeating things that I've already said. For example, the fact that Edward, even early on in his first visits to Beirut, right after being married, was close to members of the PLO. I mean, Hana Makil, as you say, and as I say, right? And Kamal Nasser. I mean, these are people I talk about, and at some length. I don't, by the way, also say anything to suggest that certain Arab political elements are uniquely guilty of car bombings. I think you completely misunderstand that whole part of my book. The part that you raise comes up in a very specific part of the book. I'm talking about how Edward, in addition to being, vilified in the press for the positions that he was taking, also was fearful at various times and for various reasons of physical harm being done to him. So it's in this section, for example, that I talk about the Zionist attacks on his office at the University at Columbia University. I talk about his father on his deathbed worrying that the Zionists would assassinate Edward, and similar kinds of things. So it's in that context that I simply say that Edward himself, in letters to Fred Halliday and in other ways, other material found in the archive, can be found saying that he is worried about things happening to him. And sometimes he says he's worried about people who have different political views than he does in the Middle East going after him. And so all I'm doing, I'm not trying to get across or underline or kind of promote some idea about Arab terrorism. Quite the opposite. That's not my politics, and that's not where I'm coming from. I'm simply pointing out the record and what, in this context of being fearful of political harm, physical harm being done to him, was said by Edward. And so that's how I would deal that. Finally, I want to say two other points and then I'll stop because I can't answer everything. I think you get the gist of what I'm getting at here, that there's a problem, a serious problem of misreading here, maybe of attentiveness to subtlety. That is that, Dominique Ede knows Edward better. Look, Edward had thousands of close friends. I wouldn't make no other claim that I was among those 1,000. I think that he had this remarkable ability to make everyone he knew and cared about feel that they were utterly close to him and that he was giving them confidences. I think Dominique Ede, because of their relationship, because of their affair, certainly feels that there was an intimacy that she shared with him that others didn't have. And on that score, who could doubt it? I'm sure that there are certain things that pass between people in such a relationship that are unique to them. What I would say is that I don't think that Dominique Ede knows Edward's personality or character or ideas any better than many other people. That what he confided to her are things that he confided to many, many others. So I don't see that there's a unique insight into his character, and I don't think that there's things that you know, she knows about him that I don't know, or the other way around. So it's that kind of thing. I think it's again, the idea in the biography was to bring all of these different elements that some people concentrate on together, and that's what I've tried to do. The last point is the question, why didn't you mention this? Why didn't you mention this? Why didn't you mention this? It isn't usually because I wasn't aware of it or that I didn't have a material on it. The first draft of this book, which I rewrote 3 times, was twice as long. You might imagine that the demands of a commercial publisher are such that you have to make decisions, hard decisions. And so my hope was that the total shape and form and arc of the thing would touch on everything that was important enough, but don't dwell on it long enough to scare readers away. And that was what I was confronted with. So I wish there were more on Mahmoud Darwish. I wish there were more on some of these other things, but you can't mention everything. And that's just goes with the territory. So thank you for letting me respond.
Thank you, Professor Timothy Brennan, for your great tolerance, comprehensive demonstration, and indeed fascinating account and answers. Thank you for that. Now, perhaps most of you mentioned a very important angle, which is the Anglicanism within the Palestinian Christian framework. And I thought, being a little bit spontaneous perhaps, although we aren't normally, and since he is with us, we have got with us someone who is actually the head of our theology cluster at the Cambridge Center for Palestine Studies. He got his PhD from Cambridge, and he himself is a Palestinian Christian Anglican priest and academic. So I'd like to have his short intervention. Dr. Reverend Yazid Sa'id, by the way, no blood relations between the Sa'ids, because there are many Sa'ids as there are many Khouris and Khatibs, etc. So if I could have your observations, please, Yazid.
Thank you very much, Dr. Makram, and thank you to everybody who's been chairing and sharing in these fascinating ideas about Professor Brennan's excellent book. I will just be very brief here, and I'm very grateful for Dr. Makram to invite me to share in these reflections. I'm particularly interested in the most important factor that Professor Brennan raised in his presentation of the book, which is the importance of the critical intellectual, that Edward Said's most important legacy wants to be. He wants it to be, if it wants to be anything, he wants it to be that of the critic intellectual, if you like. And I think this is incredibly important, especially if it's to be celebrated at a time and in a culture that doesn't necessarily appreciate such gifts. I think we all agree that academia or university studies are important because they are there for the public good. But of course, if the public good is not something that is much appreciated in the culture, they can be disdained. And Edward Said's legacy in that regard, I think, is very important as an addition to these reflections, as a reminder, if you like, of the need to remember how the intellectual critic remains an important public good. And this is something that I think is interestingly, he shares with Anglican thinkers. I mean, I don't know if you are familiar with some of the books of one of the patrons of the Center for Palestine Studies, Rowan Williams. Said's concern for morally informed criticism is in fact shared with Rowan Williams's book. One of his books is called Why Study the Past? And Rowan Williams shares very similar issues about why study the past. It's you might say this is a very good question. Said's critique, in a sense, points to a similar foundational question. Why is it important to embark on Orientalist studies at all? And the answer is twofold. In as much as I can remember from his works. And I think that comes up a little bit with Professor Brennan's book, the power struggles involved in the construction of knowledge of the other, and by which the West defines its own self-identity and establishes its superiority. Now, there has been a good deal of attacks on Said's theory here by other Palestinian intellectuals, in fact. For example, the scholar at Columbia University, Wael Hallaq, raised questions about some of these issues, pointing to the fact that Said remains sort of within the realms of Western Enlightenment himself, that he is the product himself of Western modernity. But I think despite these issues, I think Said's point remains important and I think this is the most important legacy. I think that we have to keep kind of raising and celebrating from his works, because, you know, when we use the word enlightenment, when we use the word modernity, you know, these are hardly used neutrally when they are used in public sphere or in academic circles, and whenever we do share reflections on the works of Edward Said or on the Orient or indeed on European culture, the way we criticize, the way we reflect on them is in fact itself the product. It's a kind of modernity that allows us to makes it possible to talk about various traditions in this way. And I think that's what Edward Said reminded us of. You know, to be modern isn't simply only to stand against authority, but it is also the awareness that this transmission of tradition is not simply a matter of handing on an unchanged system. And this suggests, therefore, that to embrace skepticism, to embrace that critical edge that Edward Said was so concerned about unquestioned authority and the need for reasoned justification, you know, of obedience for any authority. By the way, I think my understanding of him is that he also had reservations about nationalism of types, not just religious fanaticism. But he sees this as a good thing. And I think this is a reflection of the good Enlightenment legacy that we have to keep celebrating, I think, which comes across very well in Edward Said's writings. And Hallaq's works do not really engage much with, or Hallaq's criticism of Edward Said do not really engage much with this side of the Enlightenment. Maybe because it will allow us to kind of concede more to Edward Said's style of critique, which depends often on the 18th century Italian Giambattista Vico, who was considered by the political theorist of the last century, Isaiah Berlin, as a counter-Enlightenment figure, in that he stands against the first generation of Enlightenment figures that were convinced that rationality is one and the same in every human situation, something that Edward Said did not accept. So there is a nuanced element, I think, in Said's Orientalism and thought that doesn't receive justice in the thoughts of his critics, be they Arab or Western in that regard. And I think this is why I think Professor Brennan's contribution is a lot more nuanced than what some people think or celebrate it to be. And I will bring my contribution to an end here. Thank you, Makram.
Many thanks, Dr. Reverend Yazid Said, for this personal, spontaneous, yet very thoughtful intervention. I recall us actually attending the lecture delivered by Wael Hallaq 2 years ago, and I'm delighted that actually you have just published a few weeks ago a paper about this topic, because you are, after all, as well, in addition to the fact that you are a priest, an Anglican Palestinian priest.
It's 20 hours.
Sorry, you are as well a scholar of Islamic studies. Now, I'll have to say that we have been receiving, not only today, but since we started our book discussion series, a lot of suggestions of, ideas, proposals, and it's been heartwarming to receive all this support. But we are, after all, just beginning, and we absolutely assure you that we will be rising to this great challenge. And we will be having about this very particular, perhaps, topic, maybe another angle. I'm talking about the legacy of Edward Said, another symposium next September. Now, last but not least, and according to our, the Cambridge Center for Palestine Studies house style, we do always have a special guest who delivers a vote of thanks. And today we are delighted, privileged, and have the honor of having Dr. Kamal Khalaf-Al-Tawil. Dr. Kamal Khalaf-Al-Tawil is a towering public figure and intellectual himself, although he is a medical doctor, a very successful medical doctor. He knew Edward Said, late Edward Said. They were friends in this way or another. And he is a writer as well. I have to tell you that I receive emails from him maybe 24/7, writing new material, critique, a fascinating one, because he's a daring writer and someone who does not actually perhaps hide his opinions. So Dr. Kamal Khalaf-Al-Tawil, we are delighted that you are here and you have agreed to deliver on behalf of the Cambridge Center for Palestine Studies your vote of thanks, conclusion, remarks, observation. The floor is yours, and so is the mic, if you could kindly unmute it. No, Doctor, you haven't unmuted yet.
Many thanks, Dr. Makram, first for honoring me with the invitation to be with you and to also be the one presenting the vote of thanks. I really honestly can't find words to thank you and thank the center for the good job and for this particular podium that enriched me quite a bit. On behalf of myself, and I believe on behalf of the participants, I really can't heap my praise and lavish appreciation for the whole course of this magnificent event, including, first and foremost, the presenter, Professor Timothée Brennan, the Professor Falk for his good introduction, and also my friend, Dr. As'ad Abu Khalil, for his lively engagement and debating style, and also, and really, for Dr. Said, Yazid Said, with particular reference to the issue of Professor Wael Hallaq, and also for Dr. Noha Khalaf, with high appreciation as well. Look forward to, being part and parcel of such forums as time comes, and with the good care of Dr. Makram. Until then, would hope every one of us good health and good career, and one more time to see each other in a better, forthcoming forums. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Dr. Makram.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kamal Khalaf-Al-Tawil. Truly, any event such as this event relies on the goodwill of many, especially the speakers. And we have been privileged tonight, in Cambridge, England time, to have presented and discussed the book of Professor Timothy Brennan about Edward Said, the first practically comprehensive biography about the late Edward Said. It is a fascinating work, and nobody can include everything in one book. And it's only perhaps the beginning of more publications and research about the late Edward Said. This event clearly couldn't have happened without the wonderful efforts of the author, Professor Timothy Brennan, Professor Richard Falk, Professor As'ad Abu Khalil, Dr. Yazid Sa'id, Dr. Noha Khalaf, without Her Excellency, as she asked, and definitely the companionship and the proposals of Dr. Kamal Khalaf-Al-Tawil. I truly thank other people who helped us with this event, but they asked us not to mention the names. However, I do have to mention the names of all those members of our Cambridge Center for Palestine Studies who have been helping throughout the last 12 weeks preparing for this event. And these include Sarah, Sophia, Victoria, definitely Julia, Yazid, and above all, Tina, and definitely our little companion, which marks the end of every webinar and event we hold, which is this little bell, marking the end and the closure of this webinar. I thank you all once again, and please do not forget to buy this fascinating book, and definitely follow the critique that will be written, definitely as well, including the critique by Professor As'ad Abu Khalil and Dr. Noha Khalaf and the rest. Many thanks, very kind of you to have attended. I thank all the participants as well, and we'll see you soon. Please follow our website and Twitter, and you can communicate with us via email as well. Thank you very much, and good luck, good night, good day, and good evening to the others. Bye-bye.